This week, Tony Koran from Lacework is with us to discuss how infrastructure as code is changing cloud security for the better. Then, Dan Freckling from Boltiv joins us to talk about why U.S. data privacy is getting overhauled in 2023. Finally, in the enterprise security news, we catch up on 2 weeks of news, starting with 18 funding rounds and several new products. Splunk acquires TwinWave. Another ASM vendor, TemplarBit, gets acquired into the cyber insurance industry. InfoSec layoffs continue in a big way alongside huge cuts at Facebook, Twitter, and Amazon. Microsoft sued for stealing code to train GitHub Copilot. Google sued for tracking when users asked them not to. Apple sued for violating privacy when users asked them not to. A bit of a trend there. Taking away kids' smartphones, stealing passwords from Mastodon, and should cryptocurrency die in a fire? All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
The shift to remote and hybrid work over the past 2 years has accelerated application development on cloud infrastructure. However, securing these new assets has lagged behind. Qualys CloudView, the next generation of cloud security posture management, delivers an end-to-end multi-cloud security and compliance solution encompassing the entire application lifecycle from build to runtime. CloudView enables enterprises to assess their cloud security and compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, auto-remediate issues, proactively enforce best practices, and prove compliance in audits rapidly and efficiently. Identify your most vulnerable cloud assets by visiting securityweekly.com/Qualys. Customers want fast and frictionless digital experiences, yet also expect protection against breaches, privacy violations, and fraud. Drive engagement by optimizing security and convenience to attract and retain customers. Use the PingOne cloud platform to build, test, and optimize digital experiences. The no-code orchestration engine weaves together authentication, user management, and MFA, all of which can enhance security, drive engagement, and boost revenues. Visit securityweekly.com/ping identity to learn more. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy Butter Day. This is episode 297, recorded on Thursday, November 17th, 2022. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me is the czar of Zero Trust, the captain of content, Katie Teitler. How are you, Katie?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm highly caffeinated.
I know you said, but how does that align with World Butter Day?
So there's this thing called bulletproof coffee. Have you ever heard of this thing?
I have, hence my leading question.
I didn't intend for it to align with National Butter Day, but it does. I tried this thing once, and I read some posts about it, but it's a thing that's supposed to be healthy, where you take like a whole stick of butter and just blend it with black coffee and drink it. A whole stick. Like,
it sounds weird, but at the same time, I'm kind of tempted.
Yeah, it's do it once, sure. It's delicious, but I don't think anybody should be consuming a stick of butter a day.
Perhaps not the best thing for one's arteries.
Yeah, there's some folks who experimented with it, and it's supposed to be like a health hack, but there's some folks who experimented with it, and they're like, yeah, cholesterol kind of went crazy after I started doing that. So
Surprising.
Yeah, I did it once. It's an interesting taste. I prefer my black coffee just black coffee. I don't put any.
You sure you prefer your black coffee black?
Yes, I do. Yeah, and flavored coffee flavored as well.
Excellent.
I'm one of those. Also joining us is my, speaking of caffeine, my good friend Guillaume agreed to stand in as emergency co-host today. Hello, Guillaume. How are you?
Hey, I was doing great until you mentioned butter coffee. I think I'm just going to drink some water.
And I mentioned you had a company called Caffeine Security, so that's what made me think of you when
Yeah,
were
and
talking
it
about.
still exists. That's where when I make a training for Pluralsight and all that, that's all through my company, Caffeine Security.
Oh, cool. Cool. I didn't realize you kept it around. Awesome. All right. Quick announcement here, Security Weekly listeners. We need to hear your voices. Leave us your feedback on Apple Podcasts and submit a screenshot to our giveaway form for a chance to win a $100 gift card from Hacker Warehouse. The giveaway will be open until the end of the year. And we appreciate your honest feedback. You know, if you've got suggestions or criticism, that's fine. If you just want to leave a great glowing review, that's also fine. But yeah, we'd love the feedback. It really helps people looking for a podcast to follow. You know, if we do have some kind of feedback on there. And that form is at securityweekly.com/giveaway is where you can enter that contest. All right. Today's topic is on infrastructure as code and how it's changing cloud security for the better. We're excited to have Tony, and I hope I said that right. I should have asked you before, but is it Koran?
It's Karen, but that's okay. Close enough. You're in the ball.
Okay.
Yeah, you're in the
Aram.
ballpark. It's all good.
Yeah. I should have asked. So Tony Koran is the principal product marketing manager at Lacework. Tony has spent more than 25 years in marketing and product roles covering data protection, vulnerability management, IAM, and cloud security. And finally, he's a big believer that security takes a village, which amen to that. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, so I thought a good place to start here. We've talked about infrastructure as code on the show before, but you know, I know it's for a lot of our listeners, it still might be one of those terms that you hear, but you don't really kind of fully understand what that means, infrastructure as code, or you might just have a rough idea. So I thought it might be good to kind of level set, lay some foundation and talk about what infrastructure as code means, what that actually is.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. So, you know, historically, infrastructure was configured and managed manually, right? Engineers were responsible for developing network and system architectures. Database folks were responsible for spinning up databases, implementing them using physical servers, and maintaining them throughout, you know, their life cycle. And infrastructure as code's really changed all that. So now using tools, infrastructure as code tools like Terraform or CloudFormation or Pulumi, developers and engineers can automate that entire process. It's possible for them to programmatically spin up resources, especially in the cloud for sure, to spin up resources very quickly and spin down or destroy resources very quickly as well. This gives them a really high level of autonomy to self-service building out cloud infrastructure. So using those tools, again, that I mentioned, they can quickly orchestrate the compute, storage, database, and other resources that their application needs without really involving other teams that used to be involved in that process.
So it sounds extremely powerful. And of course, anytime something is extremely powerful and we're talking about infrastructure and automation, it should also terrify you, right?
Exactly.
Like, man, you can cause damage at some serious scale here if you get something wrong or somebody gets access to your infrastructure as code scripts. Do we call them scripts? Configuration
for sure.
files?
Yeah, for sure. And you know, there's you know, a lot of the gates certainly from a security perspective, you know, security used to rely on gates and handoffs between teams as sort of checkpoints to secure code and other things. And yeah, those sort of checkpoints and handoffs have evaporated. So right, there's a lot of power that's been put in the hands of, you know, software developers, platform engineers, infrastructure engineers. There's a lot of goodness that can come out of it, but it needs to be managed accordingly.
Well, I guess there's a lot of advantages where you can keep things much cleaner and much safer, but it does create a situation where it's like the keys to the kingdom, right? Like any management system with so much power will definitely be a target. Like your CI/CD is a target. Now, if you're doing infrastructure as code, your infrastructure can be targeted through that. So I guess it's a double-edged sword, but I definitely prefer one of the sides of it, if one can say that, right? Like just having an infrastructure that's so much cleaner because everything's automated, code reviewed, but then you got to be careful, who or what has the ability to push these changes out.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. When you look at sort of the inherent benefits, or at least the inherent security benefits, there's a lot of speed, performance, speed, sort of time to market benefits with infrastructure as code. If you kind of look at security benefits, clearly, because it all relies on automation, right? You eliminate a lot of the human error that might be involved otherwise, right? So that clearly eliminates some of the risk associated with building out infrastructure. It also ensures, Guillaume, like you were just talking about, that you can consistently provision the same or very similar environments every single time. And again, and because it's code, it can be easily documented, it can be version controlled, it can be audited, managed. It helps avoid ad hoc configuration changes, which can cause organizations a lot of angst and pain and problems. And then finally, I think it also promotes this idea of immutable infrastructure, where organizations are really trying to lock down sort of what good looks like and restrict making configuration changes to infrastructure outside of a well-defined, process, a pipeline process, for sure.
So we
Katie,
know that
you had
automation is the key to scalability and efficiency, but for many years, it's caused security people and a lot of IT people a lot of heart palpitations. And while we talk about it and everybody knows it's the only way to scale, it's the only way to deal with the hiring issues that we have, there is, as you mentioned, some angst around it. So when you're talking about this, when you're talking about the automation part of it, what are some of the areas of resistance that you get, and how are you overcoming them? And then on the flip side, what are the areas that users are willing to accept, and where do they want to implement that manual oversight?
Yeah, I think I would say, like, automation, the word automation in general can be scary for security people, right? I think in general. So I think, making sure, I think there's two sides to this. I think there's some natural, like we talked about, benefits from a security perspective for infrastructure as code. However, I think you need to be very cognizant that because you're sort of moving the keys to the kingdom or giving a lot of power to developers, and people building sort of infrastructure, you absolutely have to be constantly checking, to make sure that what they're building is, one, what you expect, and two, what you want from a security and compliance perspective. So for me, I think it's about overlaying on top of the inherent benefits that infrastructure as code provides, because it's codified and because now it can be automated. I think the task really is to bring security automation now left, if you would, as far left as you can, sort of to match the automation and speed at which organizations are spinning up infrastructure, right? So being able to take rules and policies and checks and be able to apply those checks to make sure that you're meeting either internal standards or best practices or external standards and best practices.
Did these facts, this natural skepticism, did they slow down the adoption process at all? Are we still in an educational phase of what infrastructure as code is, or are we at a rapid rate of adoption yet? Where are we in that curve?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say, like, anything that has to do, well, from a security perspective, is certainly seems to be evolutionary in its growth, not revolutionary in its growth, for sure. But I would say, if you look at infrastructure as code just at its face and put security concerns or issues aside for a moment, I would say, if you look back about 3 or 4 years ago ish, there was probably less than, I would say, 10% of companies that were really using infrastructure as code in a meaningful way, right? In what's meaningful? Meaningful is probably, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20% of their applications, they were using infrastructure as code sort of to provision those applications and services. And that's changed quite a bit. I pulled a statistic just recently to kind of prep for this. And, ESG just recently published a study around sort of shift left and infrastructure as code in particular. And they talk about the fact that today about 20% of organizations use infrastructure as code for 50% of more of their applications. So that's a big jump, I think, in the past few years. And that number, is going to sort of exponentially increase to about 2 out of 3. So 2/3 of organizations expect within the next 24 months that they'll be using infrastructure as code to provision more than 50% of their applications and services. So within a 5-year span, we've gone from something that's relatively nascent, early adopter type technology to something that's very widespread, in my opinion.
And so something that's really interesting. Sorry, I'll hand off to you in a second.
I was just going to ask you. You said you think it's going to keep increasing. I totally agree with that. What do you think will be like the long tail of the stuff that just refuses to become managed over infrastructure as code? I think like on the server side, especially as things are moving to like containers, Kubernetes, cloud, just makes it very easy. But I think on the endpoint side, right? Like people still use MDM that has like clicky UIs. Then there's probably a whole bunch of enterprise apps, the stuff that you buy off the shelf. Your HR software, all of that is probably not that easy to deploy on infrastructure as code. Probably still requires like VMs that are very specific to that. So what do you think is like the next thing that will finally get IAC'd, if that's a verb? And then what's the last thing that will refuse to get IAC'd?
Yeah. So specifically, I'm not sure if I can answer specifics. What I would say is, it kind of, I look at it as following similar path to cloud. So, there's a big rush to cloud. Everybody's moving applications. Most people are moving applications to cloud, but there's certainly a number of core applications, enterprise applications that might never make their way to cloud for lots of different reasons. Whether because, larger organizations have built these very complex nested environments that they really don't want to touch or really can't figure out, best ways to sort of move them or don't see economical reasons to move them. I would say it's probably similar for, these, what I would consider cloud native technologies. I know infrastructure as code can be used in lots of other places, not just cloud, but relative to cloud adoption, I would think, they would follow sort of the same suit.
Yeah, I think, an interesting trend I'm seeing here is an actual metric, that I've seen some boards now asking companies about, particularly startups in the age of ransomware extortion, the kinds of attacks that can threaten to take down infrastructure. What's the time frame to reboot the business? So kind of like a business continuity metric now is like not just switch over to a DR environment. A lot of cloud first organizations are, kind of live failover to other cloud regions and things like that. But actually just standing everything up from scratch is kind of like a desirable thing from a chaos engineering or a site reliability engineering standpoint. Now, I'm seeing more and more of that these days. Some kind of expectation that, yes, that's something that you can do and that you test it and that okay, we can do it in a day or so many hours.
Yeah, It's essentially you're reducing the need for backing up a lot, right? You back up the data, some configurations and everything else is in infrastructure as code, but that means that your code repository is now the absolute one thing you must protect, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's becoming more and more of a target, right? The whole supply chain, especially, repositories as well are becoming a target. I look at, like we were talking about the growth a little bit. So I look at the growth of sort of this and, from my lens, from the Lacework lens, because we're all about cloud, I would say, it's been about 10 years since Mark Anderson wrote an essay entitled Software is Eating the World. And, if you fast forward to today, you can make the argument that most companies need a software strategy to effectively compete in whatever market they play in, and certainly to open up new markets or new categories. And if cloud is becoming sort of the dominant place where, software is, either written or configured or managed or run, then you'd argue every company is in essence almost a cloud company, or at least needs an effective cloud strategy, which is really evidenced by the growth in things like infrastructure as a service, and then, cloud native technologies, including things like infrastructure as code and containers and microservices architectures. So I think, cloud is really a driving force in growing the use of infrastructure as code.
Yeah, so I want to ask a few quick foundational questions, and then jump to the kind of stuff that you actually find and that you're looking for when you scan infrastructure as code. I'm only aware of a few infrastructure as code tools here. Generally, I hear Terraform and CloudFormation when this is mentioned. So, kind of the question there: are there any other tools that we should be aware of? That you can scan. And then the other side, the other foundational thing is infrastructure as code specifically a cloud thing, or are people using it for both private workloads, that they run in their own data centers, or maybe colos and things like that, as well as public cloud providers?
Yeah, so I would say sort of on the first piece. So there are a lot of infrastructure as code tools out there. Again, we mentioned things like Terraform and CloudFormation. CloudFormation's, sort of AWS's version. There's ARM. I think they renamed it to Bicep, which is Microsoft's sort of version. And Google has their own language as well. In addition, there's open source tools like Pulumi. There's other tools like Ansible. So there's a number of these products out in the marketplace for sure. Things we're looking for, or when we're scanning infrastructure as code from a security and compliance standpoint, I would say, we're looking for things like misconfigurations, like unsecured data storage elements or containers, excessive permissions and privileges, default credentials in configuration settings left unchanged, hard-coded secrets, unrestricted access to ports in services, and certainly unsecured secrets. So there's certainly a number of things that companies are looking for when they scan infrastructure as code. And there's a number of standards out there, benchmarks like, the Center for Internet Security, or CIS, has benchmarks that they provide that folks can use. CSA, the Cloud Security Alliance, has CCM, which is a control catalog of a bunch of control objectives that folks can use. And there's a few other best practices out there.
So you're scanning in the code, you're essentially scanning for pretty much everything that a cloud security solution would be scanning on things that are currently running, right? Except you're doing it before the stuff even runs.
Yeah, so it's very synonymous to, right, like a cloud security posture management tool would look at, configuration of all your resources that are active in cloud, but it does it in runtime. So you're doing something very similar, except you're doing it in build time before deployment.
Right. So let's kind of shift to talking about the kind of stuff that you're finding in here. Like I assume credentials are a thing that you probably would find in infrastructure as code. What are some of the other security issues that you're finding with these scanners?
Yeah, so certainly, like I was mentioning, credentials are something we find. We find, companies, hard-coded secrets is certainly a challenge or a problem, right? It's easier sometimes for developers to actually hard code secrets because they know applications and service accounts need those secrets or those passwords, right, to do the jobs that they need to do. Certainly, excessive permissions is something we look for. So, in cloud, looking for, wildcards, in other things like that, which can be no-nos. You certainly want to restrict access to resources and data, certainly within the cloud. Other things also, like just the fact that basic security tools or basic security settings are turned off, or things like logging is turned off or not enabled for organizations, which then makes it really, really hard to investigate incidents after the fact. I think, again, some of the most basic things around data protection for sure. So are storage buckets enabled for encryption, right? Are, keys being rotated through key management systems? Are they being rotated based on whatever policy an organization has every 30, 60, or 90 days? Are those encryption keys managed by the cloud customer, not the cloud service provider, right? So those are some of the things we're looking for or find.
Okay, yeah. So as Guillaume was saying, a lot of it is, the same kinds of issues that you would have even if you weren't using infrastructure as code, right? Like a lot of these are cloud security best practices.
Yeah, absolutely. The one advantage to, obviously, there's several advantages to scanning infrastructure as code before it goes out the door. But certainly when you're talking about cloud and, you're talking about a very ripe environment, I think, attackers, bad actors and attackers can find misconfigurations in public cloud environments very quickly, within minutes. They can find and exploit them within minutes. So from a security and risk management perspective, right, you want to limit the attack surface as much as you can, and doing that in development or in the pipeline before things get deployed is just becomes really good practice. I would say, I was talking to a CISO of a large financial services organization, and he kind of eloquently, made the statement around how misconfiguration in cloud can be so dangerous. He said, no matter how you configure a NAS device running in your data center, there's no command you can give that you're going to make things world accessible, right? But he said that there's just too many layers between the device and the outside world. But somewhere like AWS, it's just one S3 bucket misconfiguration and your data is out there for everybody to see, right? So it's trying to avoid that event before those vulnerabilities or misconfigurations become exploitable.
And then another big advantage of IAC is limiting the need for access to production environments. How often do you see companies that are completely preventing access, like SSH access into running containers or VMs, because everything has to be done through IAC? The logs are there for investigation, and then the containers are supposed to be immutable, and therefore we just eliminated a pretty big like insider threat with access to the service accounts that are live and access to the data and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's the goal, right? For organizations, most organizations, I think if folks would be honest, I think for some organizations that's still, that's still a little bit of what I would say a North Star, or aspirational. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word. It's a little bit aspirational, and we continue to see, unfortunately, and there's good reasons sometimes, but folks having to go into production environments to make changes. And some of those are valid, very valid reasons for them to do that, and others are not. So I think you're right. I think the real goal is to build this idea of a continuous pipeline built around immutable infrastructure. If somebody wants to make changes, they have to make them from the beginning, right? In the dev world, in the build world, and not in production.
So something your colleague mentioned when we did the prep call originally for this is it's shift left, not shove left. You want to add some?
I'll mention that. Yeah.
Oh, that was you that mentioned that. Okay. Yeah. Do you want to add some color to that on what that means?
Yeah. I think to me, it's like, one of the things that will help organizations secure infrastructure as code, secure their cloud environments, was really better collaboration between, development teams, operation teams, security teams, right? Everybody, I don't want to use the word DevSecOps because it's so overused. But, I think fostering this collaboration between specifically development and security teams is really important. For the most part, I would say shift left has probably felt more like shove left for developers. Organizations historically, we're asking them to adopt these foreign security tools that disrupt their workflows, that slow them down. We expect them to build, perfect from a security and risk management perspective, code that's safe, but without having, really a good understanding of the security requirements in the checks that they need to perform, and certainly not including them in the process doesn't help build bridges. So, I think there's been a lot of confusion around, who owns what, especially in cloud. Cloud's a team sport. Everybody's sort of all in the pool. And so I think, building tools, infrastructure as code, security tools, similar to what Lacework provides, that really takes the developer experience and developer workflows and puts those sort of in the front, because we know that's the only way it's really going to work, is if developers can use tools, they stay within their existing workflows, they don't have to do a bunch of context switching, they don't have to guess at what security policies and rules to apply, they're already set for them. So when they basically commit code into they commit code or do a PR, they're automatically checking their code against some already set policies or rules that security's kind of implemented.
And you probably can do it on their IDE directly, right? Like, why even wait for someone to check in the code or file a PR?
Yep, that's right. So you want to do it as early as possible. So at IDE, when they're building or checking in code in the pipeline itself, because maybe there's some parameters like where this thing might run, US West, US East, that might not be known. Again, what we try to do is provide companies all the flexibility they need. So depending on where they want to, start checking, we recommend checking as far left as possible. But based on their structure and how they've built sort of their pipeline, we allow them to kind of stick these automated checks in everywhere.
Is there a period where you sit down, where your customers are sitting down with their devs and saying, "Hey, we're going to put this thing in," just so it's not a shock to them, like when they try and open a PR or merge code or something like that, and they get all these new errors they haven't seen before, right?
Yeah. And again, I think that gets back to collaboration, and kind of breaking down those silos. So, more mature customers of ours have, found ways to break down those silos a bit. I think there's a bit more work to do there for sure. I would, certainly getting the development teams involved early, we've seen is a good best practice for success. I think it's a lot easier for, development teams to be involved in deciding on tools early on, like so infrastructure as code security tools, getting them used to those tools, getting them to try tools, getting them to play with tools to see how they function within their workflows and within their tool chains, I think is really important. And then getting security to come in and bless those tools that they really like is probably a lot easier, or we see that a lot easier motion than for security to go off and decide in a vacuum that, oh, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And again, try to shove that onto developers.
Right. And I understand you have a biannual report that Lacework puts out that we've got here in the show notes.
Yep, we do. It's our Lacework Cloud Threat Report. Excuse me. I'm having a senior moment. Apologies for that.
Yeah, no problem. I am very familiar with those.
Yeah, and one of the things we found in that report relative to this is, you can expect as infrastructure as code becomes more popular, as infrastructure as code, as more and more applications sort of get built and provisioned using infrastructure as code, it's just that there's a higher probability for mistakes, right, to happen, and for those mistakes to make their way into production environments. And this latest Lacework Cloud Threat Report uncovered that, over the past 6 months, insecure configurations were found in over 70% of the environments we monitored. So there's still a long way for folks to go here. It's still, a problem that needs to be solved for sure.
Awesome. Good stuff. So listeners can check out the show notes and find that in there, find the links to that report. And Tony, thanks so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
Yeah, Adrian, thank you so much.
All right, stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk data privacy with Dan Freckling from Boltive.